Thank you very much, and thank you for coming after the wonderful night. It was really a pleasure last night. What I would like to share with you is some of the results, and I really had to cut out some of the results due to time constraints, of a workshop that took place in July at Johns Hopkins University, the third, and that's a good connection with TSD, third Fred Jelinek Memorial Workshop. There has been great outcomes out of this tradition of the Johns Hopkins workshops. Like the CALDI system or the iVector or machine translation. So it was an honor for me to work on that. And I listed the other people who were at the workshop or were guests or worked internally on that. So let me give you a quick overview. After motivation, I will introduce neurological diseases and the data that we used. I will talk about the vision that we have. If you have a 6-week workshop, you can only start things. And that is, how do we want to monitor people who are affected with these diseases? And then come to some experimental results, and then finally round up. So neurodegeneration, it's an umbrella term for the progressive loss of structure or function of neurons, including the death of neurons. And typical examples are Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease. Those are the two ones that we will work with. Others are Huntington's, ALS, or Batten disease. The greatest risk factor to get any of these diseases is aging. It's very often a late onset. So you acquire that disease at a later state of your life, which is the reason why we really have to deal with that. I'll come to that in a second. The neurons gradually lose function as the disease progresses with age. And this is a graph that shows you why it is a problem. And it shows that the people over 65 or over 85 are increasing, and with the aging society, it is an increasing problem, because with the increase of people, the number of people who are affected by these neurodegenerative diseases. I have here some data from Germany, and it is very typical for the industrial countries. So this is 2 generations ago, 1956, and you see the median age, and you see the percentage of the population over 65, 11%. 1 generation ago, it was 15%. Today, it's 21%. And in 1 generation, it will be 31%. So 1/3 of the population will be over 65. And with the prevalence of these diseases to be high in that age, you have a lot more people who are affected. And not only do you have a lot more people who are affected, but also you have a lot more people who will not be taken care of by their spouses. And that means that the society has the responsibility to take care of these people. And neurodegenerative diseases are not curable as of now. So I think the task that we have is to delay the symptoms. What I display here is the time of during the time when there are people affected, and here is the competences of daily life. Like, you begin the loss of speech and writing, or you have behavioral problems and so on. And the only thing that we can do is to delay these symptoms, since we cannot cure the speech. And what we would like to give to people is a longer lifespan to live in dignity. So if again, you have the time here, the degree of severity, if we can reduce the symptoms. And technology will be very important to the aid of this. So a closer look to the Parkinson disease and dementia, the most prevalent neurological diseases. Dementia is a loss in memory or mental function that interferes with daily life, caused by physical changes in the brain. At least 48 million people worldwide are affected. Alzheimer's disease is about 70% of the dementias, is a progressive neurodegenerative disease characterized by cognitive abilities, so you lose your memory, your reasoning, social abilities like linguistic abilities, you can't really talk, communicate anymore, or functional like executive power. Certain brain regions are associated with language, and they are among the first to be affected. When we try to assess them, a typical exam is the so-called mini-mental state exam, and the doctor asks the patient things like what is the year, what is the season, what is the date, and then assigns a point if the person knows it or not. There's 30 questions on that. If just to give you an impression on the linguistic effect of Alzheimer, Iris Murdoch was a famous Irish writer, and she died of Alzheimer. Agatha Christie was a famous writer, and everybody suspects that she did have Alzheimer. It's not confirmed. And James was a writer, and it's known that she did not have Alzheimer. And they all had writings over many years, and normally we don't have that, but in this case we can observe how people actually communicated, at least in writing, over a longer time. And so people looked at these writers with respect to linguistic measures, typical linguistic measures like vocabulary size or so. And if you look at, if you look at the age of the writer and when they brought out a certain book, and you look at, for instance, the percent of close distance lexical repetitions in these books, and then you can see that, with Mrs. James, it stayed kind of constant till the end of her career. And with Iris Murdoch, it continuously rose, and with Agatha Christie as well. Okay? So if you look at the linguistics, then you can actually predict. And it's interesting that these things, I mean, if you look at it, there is a certain onset way before of when you see these things way before she finally dies. Okay? So the data that we worked with, some of those were from the so-called Dementia Bank. There's 255 samples of people describing this picture. There's an interesting, this is called cookie theft. And what's happening in this picture is that you see two stories going on. The boy is trying to steal cookie, and the mother is there, and she's doing the dishes, oblivious to the fact that the water is running over. And so when you ask somebody to say, what's in this picture? You get things like a person with Alzheimer will talk about this maybe to be a ladder, or this to be a wife, and a control person will say this is the mother. Okay, so certain associations are different, and I've got here an example of
he must be picking apples here, because he's on a lot early. He's got both hands open, he can be. And the chair was falling. The baby's crying, that's all.
So we get transcriptions of these stories. We also have the audio, and it's older. It's from the 80s, so you heard the quality is not very good. And we have the mini-mental state exam for these stories. We had also fluency data, which is participants name all the animals, and it's interesting to see that people with dementia have a less ordered structure. People without dementia will say things like house animals and then switch to a different group and so on. And people with dementia don't do that. And Carolina conversations, and again, about 20 hours of Alzheimer's disease. Parkinson's disease is characterized by the progressive loss of dopaminergic neurons in the midbrain. It's the second most prevalent neurological disease, affects about 2% of people older than 65 years, and they develop several motor and non-motor impairments. Muhammad Ali and Michael J. Fox are two examples, famous examples. Speech impairment is one of the earliest manifestations, and articulation and phonation is affected by about 70 to 90% of people. The motor impairments include bradykinesia, rigidity, and postural instability, resting tremor, impaired speech. Non-motor impairments are the sensory system. They can't smell anymore, for instance, cognition, sleep, and emotion. Again, the evaluation, we have the Movement Disorder Society Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale, the UPDRS. One section of this rating scale concerns motor activities, the others social capabilities. There's 33 questions which range from 0 to 4, so the range is from 0 to 132, and the other one is a more holistic one, the Hearn and Yar. And so the one about speech is, for instance, listen to the person's speech, free-flowing speech, and engage in conversation, and then normal, slight, mild, moderate, or severe impairments. Like most speech is difficult to understand or unintelligible. In a second, I will show to you that, this UPDRS is not a good way to evaluate the speech. So what we did for the workshop, we looked at a dysortria assessment, the French A dysortria assessment, which is a standard assessment. However, it requires the evaluator to be present. And so we had to adapt that because we just had the data and we had to evaluate it afterwards. And so we modified it and we evaluated some of our data with this modified dysortria assessment. And it's an evaluation on the respiration, the lips, larynx, and so on. And the speech tests that we had were sustained vowels, and then I'll come to that in a second. Pataka, typical sequence of non-words that require your articulators to move in a certain way, and then red text and monologues. And so that's very typical when you look at Parkinson, that typically you look at affected people, you look at healthy control. You have a recording environment, like in this case, for these data, we had a soundproof booth. In others, we didn't. The age, typically, median age of the affected people is around 60. And the tasks are things like vowels, sustained vowels, ah, pataka, 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 words, certain sentences, read text, or monologue. So these are dedicated tests that we know what is being said, which makes it good to evaluate. The monologues, that's pretty close to, you just listen to somebody saying something. You know, you ask them, what did you do yesterday, for instance? And that is very close to an unobtrusive monitoring, and I'll come to that in a second. So the characteristics of Parkinson, let me play you an example. This is a Colombian patient, and his UPDRS is relatively high, 52 out of 132. So you hear reduced loudness, monotonic speech, dysarthric speech, breathy voice, imprecise articulation, slowed in this case, and very often stutter-like. Now, the correlation between speech performance and the UPDRS is there, but what we found in this workshop, there is so many outliers. So here I have this one patient, and if you look at the dysarthria assessment, she's doing very good. If you look at the UPDRS, she's doing very bad. And, oops, sorry. The reason is, if you listen to her, if you look at the arm movements, it's totally uncontrollable. Okay, so the muscle control for the arm is not there. Her handwriting, on the other hand, is not bad. And her speech is normal. Okay? So we've, at least according to our data, UPDRS is not a good reference for the speech outcome of a patient. Number one, only 2 questions concern speech in the UPDRS. It heavily depends on other factors, like the emotional state the person is in, or the time between the UPDRS and the time of the speech recording, or, and that's a very important thing, the medication intake. And I have here the difference between 2 sessions of our data, and there is an improvement if that difference is negative, and you see the majority of the people seem to improve. And there is many other factors which are not documented in data. We don't know what medication they took at what time, very often. So, at least based on our data, it's not a good reference. And so that was one of the motivations to take this Frenchet dysarthria assessment, and we asked 3 phoniatricians to label Spanish data with this assessment. According to the literature for the non-modified Frenchet test, the inter and intra-rater correlations are about 0.5 to 0.8, and the correlation with of our labelers was 0.75, so quite in the range. So the modifications were okay. And so for this workshop, in addition to the data set that we had, we collected some other. So we had multimodal data where people not only were speaking, but they also were walking, and we had gait sensors that recorded how they walk. We had handwriting sensors. It was a tablet where you got at what point in time they touched what pixel of the tablet. We had longitudinal data, so we recorded 26 patients in different sessions across 4 years, and we did that, but we never evaluated them, and that was what we looked at in the workshop. We had some genetics data. In Colombia, there's a higher prevalence than in many other areas because some people with Parkinson, some person with Parkinson came from Spain, and so there's a higher prevalence in that area. And that's a quite interesting data that we recorded. We had speech, gait, and handwriting of 7 PD people that we recorded all-day sessions, and we had 4 all-day sessions within 4 months. So this kind of shows the kind of data we have. That was our original data. That was the multimodal session. Those were the longitudinals. The blue ones are the at-home, and the orange ones, the genetic recordings. So, of course, 7 patients, you cannot make great classifications, but you can look into that and say, this is a way to progress. This is the way we should look at. And for the collection, we had pretty much, things like the Padaka, so the diadochokinetic tests. We had sentences, red text, monologues, and conversations for all these data collections. So let me say a couple words on the long-term vision that we had for the workshop, and that is monitoring. That was one part of the title of my talk. If you know that the person has this neurodegenerative disease, and if you know the progression is slow, but certain things come, a spouse dies or so, and then you might have drastic changes. Or it's affected by the medication intake. Okay? So you would like to monitor them. But on the other hand, they know they have the disease, so they should not feel tested all the time. Okay? So to that extent, it's important to have an unobtrusive test. And what it goes beyond dementia and Parkinson's. I mean, depression is another example. Stuttering is another example. Somebody with stuttering has a therapy, and then his speech is very good, but it slowly might degrade. And he's not aware of it because he denies it. Okay? So you have these kind of diseases, and you would like an unobtrusive monitoring. So there's long intervals between the medical exams. Typically, a Parkinson person comes to the neurologist every 6 months. And patients sometimes don't go if, I feel okay, I don't need to go. The early detection is currently difficult because people don't go to these screenings. And the system could the state of the patient could slowly decline, requiring adjustment, like medication adjustment. And so our vision is, and when you come after 6 months, the doctor might be a different person, or he just might want to have an executive summary. What happened in the last 6 months? And so, and we need to have a privacy guaranteed when we do that, the unobtrusive testing. So, our vision is your smartwatch, your smartphone to be your health buddy. So, while we were at the workshop, a student of mine was working back in Erlangen at developing an application for a smartphone. We developed it for the workshop in parallel, and it provides a simple, easy to use interface, and I have it on my smartphone, and I forgot about it after the third call. It records my own voice, and it analyzes my speech, only my part of the conversation. It analyzes my speech, and then it has a statistics like when did I call, how long did I talk, did I initiate the call, how long was the conversation, is the person in my personal contact list, and then it has an audio file, and that's in a database, and then it's been analyzed. So you have the communication statistics plus the analysis of the speech. And if you think, that is not a Parkinson but a depression person, if the depression person never starts not calling again his friends, that's a sign, an alarm sign, right? And so this is our vision of having this system that tells the neurologist something has changed. And if you think about Alzheimer and you think about in the future, we might have intelligent robots that do tasks for the person. And so this robot might look like that. He could come up and say, hey, I found this picture in your photo album, and who is that lady there? And that way you have a dedicated test, but the Alzheimer person doesn't know it. And she starts talking about her past, and you can analyze the speech in a way we analyze the cookie theft picture. And then, so we are thinking of our vision is a system where you observe the patient doesn't know it, you make sure that the privacy is there, that it doesn't leave the system. And if there is a change, then the doctor is informed. And then with the same system, you can make a dedicated test. So somebody can call up with with your smartphone and can make a test and say, can you say Padaka as often as you can in order to test the person. So let me now come to some of the results. So the linguistic analysis will mostly concern Alzheimer. The acoustic analysis will mostly concern Parkinson, but there is also acoustic information in the speech of Alzheimer and linguistic information in the speech of Parkinson. And then this is a really interesting thing to combine these, to combine certain informations. So, what we would like to do is combine information from the data sets with disparate properties, like the task. Okay, somebody collected the storytelling. Somebody collected name all the animals. So in this data set I have that, in this data set I have that. Can we combine this information to get a better information? We have many different collections of, everybody, typically somebody wants to get his doctorate, so he collects 50 patients of this and 50 control. And he writes his thesis, and then they're lost. And then another guy looks at a different aspect. So can we combine this information? What can we get if we have a video, if we have a gait analysis? We don't have many. Like I introduced to you the Spanish data, the Colombian Spanish data, with one of the with two recordings I have the gait analysis, with the others I don't. So what can we learn from that? And what can we accomplish with erroneous speech recognition, which is important because, these dedicated tests, you say, read the following sentence. You know what is being said. But what about spontaneous speech, where you will definitely have errors. And with elderly people, the speech recognition errors are in the order of 3 times as high as with medium-aged people, and with elderly people affected by a certain disease, it's way higher. So very often, you know, you're working with a large vocabulary speech recognition that has something like 30-40% word error rate. So we looked at the Alzheimer, and one of the things we did was we took the cookie theft and we did a geometric topic tracking. So here's a cookie jar, the boy is about to come down on the floor, and the girl, I don't know that much about girls, and the sink, and the girl may be saying, and so on. So we associated every chunk of how they described with a certain part of this picture. Well, the girl and the boy and so on, the faucet, running, sink. So it's very, very easy to look at, you know, this is the Alzheimer and that's the control. If you just look at that graph of what does it say, it's a straightforward task, right? And what we did was we modeled this with a finite state transducer. We took, you know, from when to when the little boy is trying to get cookies. So, you know, this is the boy and this is the cookie. And so we extracted these features from the task and trained the classifier to say this is Alzheimer or not. Another approach was we clustered. We clustered the words that were there from the transcription, and we just did an automatic clustering. And the automatic clustering, for instance, did put together water sink, trying, overflowing, washing, or mother, boy, girl, sister, children. Okay, so the automatic clustering according to some distance did something linguistically relevant. It was totally unsupervised, based on information theoretic criterion. And then, you know, the mother is wiping dishes, so you take the mother and put it in her cluster, wiping in that cluster is and the are stop words that are irrelevant, and so on. So you get a sequence of clusters. And then you can detect certain features like the topics mentioned divided by the number of words or the duration in time and so on. And so then you have certain things like the number of times that cluster was mentioned or the idea density, or you just get a bag of features. And then you look at each individual feature and say, how relevant is that? And we had latent Dirichlet analysis. I didn't introduce that. That's the vector clustering, and that's the finite state transducers. And then we test these data that we have, the stories, and we try to say, okay, this is from an Alzheimer, this is from control group. And it's interesting, you get amazingly good results. Just by extracting a number of features, in this case for the automatic vector quantization, we had 21 features. You get a 75% correct classification, and the area under the curve is about 0.8. And it's also interesting that these two unsupervised approaches were actually doing very good and doing actually better than the model-based finite state transducers. Another one that we looked at, we said, well, Let's just look at Engram language models from speech recognition. Now, so we looked at the engrams that occurred in these stories, and we trained Alzheimer dependent or control group dependent Engram language models. In this case, we used Knaser-Nye smoothing, trigram language models to explore whether or not the perplexity is the same or is different. The perplexity is a measure of how well can this language model predict the following word. Now, why would we want to do that? Well, it's language independent. You know, you don't look at linguistic features for which you need a parser which will be erroneous, you know, with a spoken language. It's simple to extract. You know, you take the best recognized word chain. You don't need any parsing. And in my group, we showed that this is actually an excellent predictor on the word of Iris Murdoch, on the one that I introduced. So in written language is excellent. So what we did was we had this language model on control, and we had this language model on Alzheimer. And the perplexity, in this case, of the Alzheimer is the red, and the blue is the control. Now, the lower the perplexity, the better that person is modeled. Now, if you take the control, now some of those Alzheimer people will behave normal, quote unquote, and many will behave unnormal. So the perplexity, the way am I able to predict the next word that person is going to say, and if that word is ladder, which I've never seen with a control person, because no control person will look at a stool and say that's a ladder, and several of the Alzheimer people did. Then the perplexity will jump up, because I've never seen ladder. So there's quite a large difference here. In here, if I train with Parkinson data, some of those speak like they don't have Parkinson, so the difference will be smaller. Because the control people will be partly covered, and of course the perplexity still is different because every person says something unobserved. And you know, it's just much more difficult to predict what the Alzheimer person is going to say next. Another one, and that's what I'm saying, is that even though the linguistic capabilities are affected, we can get still a lot out of acoustics, and that is, for instance, the pausing. If an Alzheimer person doing pauses, so we looked at filled pauses like, word finding problems, and unfilled pauses. We looked at features like, when did it start? How long did it last? What's the medium duration of that pause or so? And then, we get a bunch of features and we say this one is relevant or not. And so if we look at all these approaches and we try to classify this person is talking with Parkinson, yes or no. The Engram, just the 2 Engram perplexities, it's amazing. They got almost the best result. If you just look at how well is a speech recognizer capable of predicting, that already gives you 75%. And the area on the curve is 0.8. Then the finite state reducers, late Dirichlet analysis, the vector quantization I mentioned, certain things like linguistic terms, the unfilled pauses, the filled pauses, you always get significant results, and if you combine all of this, you get about 80%. So we're actually capable, when we know what is being said, we know they're talking about a certain topic, we're actually capable of of finding these differences. And what I said in my monitoring vision, if you show somebody a picture of a family or so, and if the daughter or the grandson marked, this is my aunt such and such, you know to some extent what they're talking about. So you can do an unobtrusive test by asking an Alzheimer person to, about a certain subject. The person doesn't know it, that is being tested, and you can still get a reasonable result. Let me look at the acoustic analysis, and that's mostly the Parkinson. One of the things we did was we took the padaka. So what we did is, you say padaka, 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 as long as you can. So we created a recognizer of padaka, and we used this, just a speech recognition system that can just recognize padaka. And that way we counted the padakas, and then we created a recognizer that can recognize pa, ba, da, and so on. And we count the errors. And here's an example. And if you look at the healthy controls, and if you look at the error rate, how many pa, intended pa, were recognized as ga, da, ba, or so on. For the Parkinson, it's about 3 times as high. If at different collections that we had, it was always significant. So the imprecise consonant caused by the reduced range of movement of the articulators is right there. Another approach we did was we built a utterance-specific eye vector. Eye vectors are an approach from speaker recognition that model the variability of that person. And then we averaged all the eye vectors of the utterance of that speaker, and then we kind of display them. Another one was that we built a HMM finite state transducer system where we know that person is supposed to say that sentence, and we measure the a posteriori probability, and we try to induce things from that. And then we use the Salmon transform to have these high-dimensional vectors and display them on a 2D way, where the distance, something is close or far away in the high dimension, is conserved. This is called the Salmon transform. So this is a model for the finite state transducer. A red sentence 1, red sentence 2, red sentence 3. And then we count the probability. And then we have a vector of a posterior probabilities. And we can do regressional classification. We can say the Parkinson degree is severe or non-severe, or this is Parkinson versus control. And so if you look at, for instance, the posteriors, the healthy control, it's about twice as high. So the acoustic, the machine, the automatic speech recognition, can predict the closeness to the intended model about twice as good. For words, for sentences, for red text, it's always the same. The Parkinson people, because of the bad articulation, are significantly worse. Using this, we get about 70% recognition rate. And if we if we correlate this with the French A, we get about 0.6, which is pretty good, okay? And this is the salmon map. And it shows the, from these high-dimensional vector into the 2D, it shows that the controls are over here and that the Parkinson people are over here. And if I look at it separately from male versus female, it's interesting. Dysarthria can have many causes. Not only Parkinson people speak dysarthric. The male people, there was many heavy smokers, and it showed that those tend to move a little bit over here. This lady was always misclassified. She was a control. No, which one was it? No, I think this one. This one was always misclassified. A control lady. She had no teeth. And, you know, you listen to her. The first thing I did was, you know, we did a couple classifications. I listened, and I said, hey, you know, control person 10 is always wrong. And I listened to her, and I said, that sounds funny. And I asked my colleague, and he says, that's the person with no teeth. So it seems in this, at least in our data, it seems like the women were a little bit better separable. And it might really be, and that's one of the lessons that we really learned, even though we age and gender matched and even educational level matched the control to the patients, there's a couple things you really have to keep in mind, like smoking. The guy, the PhD student, he wanted to get the data. He doesn't know that many 70-year-old people. So he asked his father, and his father, you know, went to the bar where he normally has his drink and collected these people, and it's not a good average, probably. So with the eye vector, we got about 87% on our Colombian data set. We had some Czech data which were comparable. We get about 85%. If we look at the correlation with the French A, we get about 69. And again, for females, it was better. And I would not say that's a general outcome. It might have to do with our control groups. Different, you know, if you take the monologue, the red text, you know, monologues seem to be better in this case, and so on. So we can say that we get a good distinction between Parkinson and healthy speakers, a substantial correlation with perceptual French A dysarthria assessment. It's not as high, but it's getting there. Remember the French A evaluators, the humans had about a 7.5. And so if we try to predict the UPDRS, we're not doing that good. You know, 0.3 for the German, 0.2 for the Czech, 0.4. Because the UPDRS evaluates a lot more. There's only 1 out of the 33 questions that concern speech. It's the limp, the shaking, and I showed you the example of the lady. Her hands were going like that, her speech was okay. If we look at the dysarthria, we had the 3 labelers. Our approaches were, you know, in a very good range, and around 0.7, and 0.75 was what the human labelers did. And so if you look at that, the correlation is much better. Now, what can we do to combine? So we have these different data sets. Some are controlled, some are uncontrolled, some have a transliteration, some don't, and so on. So can we combine this? Well, the first one was we looked at at the gait. So we had the multimodal data that I introduced where we had speech, gait, and handwriting. And so, for instance, you take a 10-meter walk and you have this accelerator on your shoe. And you just walk, and then you get the accelerator data at a rate of about 100 measures per second or so. And then you can combine that, and it's a much better correlation than with speech, because most of the questions of the UPDRS concern the outer limbs. And the correlation is about 0.74. Another thing is the prediction of the medication. It's not documented in most data collections, but what if I do know that? For the at home, we did have when did they take what, and there is a onset time. That's when I take the medication. That's my maximum. How much it works, and that's the decay. So we had this for the different medications. So you look in the literature and you saw levodopa. It takes 1 hour to work, and the half-life is 1.2 hours. Okay, so you have this exponential decay, and then you have this model where the darker, the more the medication works, and so basically, this is when you take it, this is when it works most, and there's an exponential decay, then you take the next one, and so on. Okay? And so what we did was we said, well, we have the UPDRS for that person, and we have the recording. So over a whole day. Let's look at that. And let's predict with our automatic predictor what is his UPDRS. And it turns out that, we had 7 patients, so I cannot give you recognition results. But this is for the gait data. And as you can see, the 0, that's the UPDRS, the predicted UPDRS, the UPDRS that we're trying to predict. And, if the medication is a little bit long away, then the UPDRS is gets lower. In this case, for instance, here is higher. So you have a certain tendency. And if you do the same thing for speech, and speech is not as good a predictor, you get a different result. If you combine them, you get interpretable results. Like in this case, you get that tendency that where the medication intake means that his behavior improves, his gait and speech improves, and then here it gets worse again. Okay. So we really that's not an outcome. It's a start to say we really have to model this when we look at people, when we look at Parkinson people. So I would say we can automatically predict the UPDRS values in an at-home scenario, in an unobtrusive scenario. It works much better for gait data, but if we combine the modalities, we actually get better. And so the next topic I would like to address is we have all these different informations, and some of them are missing in some data, and some are there. Can we combine that? So for the Alzheimer data, we looked at the conversation data, and we looked at the cookie theft. Two different collections. And we get 95%, and we did a feature selection, we get 95 and 81%. But if we take the exact same features, and we get horrible results because the task is different and so on. So we can take acoustic features, syntactic features, acoustic and lexicosyntactic features, and we get certain results. And, you know, we can take them and test on here and test on here. And so the question is, can we combine these totally different data sets and get better results? So basically, what we did is we took the one data set, we had 380 features, and with a PCA, we get them down to 40, and we get some features. And we took the cookie set, and we get 40 different features. Now, if we combine these very different data sets, we get mostly different features. But some actually are the same. Now, look what's interesting is we lose a little bit by going from these task-specific features to the ones that were created out of the whole thing. We lose a little bit. We go from 81 to 79. However, keep in mind, that's what we had when we had the task-specific features. So by combining the tasks and looking at features that are good for both tasks, we actually get better. Now another thing that is really that was one of the most interesting outcomes for me is the so-called multifuel learning. So let me say I have some data for which I have certain views. And I have some other data for which I only have that view. So what is a view? It's the gait analysis. For some of the Spanish data, I have gait analysis. For the others, I don't. So in this case, I might have acoustic view of the data and lexicosyntax. But at the runtime, I only have the acoustic view. Or I might have a manual transcription and automatic speech recognition, but at runtime, I only have the automatic speech recognition. Now, what I'm doing is the following. Based on the result of this view, I make a transformation on these data, on these features that will improve my analysis, and then I use this transformation in test. Now let's look what happens. So the baseline, we had only acoustic information, and at runtime acoustic information, and we had 84%. If we did this transformation of the acoustic features based on the lexicosyntactic features which we only had in training, and then tested with these acoustic features, we got to 88. When we did a correlation with the UPDRS score based on speech, on gait, and on handwriting, we get significant correlations. We don't always have that. So we train on speech, handwriting, and gait in the multimodal database, and then we test on the different database where we only have speech. And this is pretty interesting. For the classification, Parkinson versus control, we get slightly better with the UPDRS, which we were very bad with speech, we get better. And the Frenchet, which concerns the dysarthria. So somebody looks at the speech and says, this is dysarthric or not. We actually get a nice improvement by looking how he walks. Okay? And so I think this is a very interesting, because you have all these different collections, with those guys did this, those guys did this. If you combine them, you can actually get better. So let me summarize the progress we made and where to go. We improved our classification regression for dedicated tests. Okay? We get up to 87% for Parkinson versus healthy control, up to 0.7 correlation for individual features, the Engram Perplexity, which was not used before. We improved the classification when combining red tasks and monologues in testing on monologues. We improved feature selection using this algorithm when combining different tasks like picture description, conversation, or handwriting and speech. And we showed that acoustic information is important for Alzheimer, and linguistic is actually also important for Parkinson. I didn't mention that, but if you look at the kind of verbs people use, it says a lot about what state of Parkinson they're in. Is this an active word or a passive word or so on? And that was from the monologue. So we asked them, what did you do yesterday? And we look at the verbs. It's amazing correlation. I think the UPDRS is not a good reference without additional information. It's just a snapshot. The neurologist evaluates the person. In our longitudinal data, we showed more improvements than worsening over the time of a Parkinson, which is what we didn't think that would happen. But it is really because you don't have the information. You know, if the person takes the medication, yes or no. It seems to change significantly with medication, testing condition, and form of the day. Speech is less affected by these changes. Gait is much more affected. We developed and tested a modified dysortria rating for the workshop. It can be used for existing speech collections, which is important, that you do have an evaluation just by listening to the sound. We had significantly better results than with the UPDRS. The agreement of people is only slightly better. The Pataka was the best subtest for this dysortria, which makes sense because you move your articulators from the bilabial p to alveolar d to velar k. So by doing that as fast as you can, this is a pretty good test. So what we need to do is refine the rating based on the results of the workshop and discuss these outliers with phoniatricians, why, and so on, and repeat labeling with different phoniatricians and label the other languages, the Czech and the German. We have very preliminary results for the at-home recording. We developed a model for the medication intake. It seems to correlate with automatically predicted UPDRS scores. It works better for gait. We did not have, one of the biggest problems is the forgotten medicine. People take up to 8 times a day medication for Parkinson. And of course, for ethical reasons, we didn't tell the people don't take your medication. So if that had the case, and there's estimates that up to 50% of the medication is not taken regularly. So even without that forgotten medication effect, we did find some very encouraging results, and that's really what we need to look into more. We will need way more data so far. We want to put all the analysis software that we developed during the workshop as open source. And we want to use our data for a ASRU competition. So we applied for a challenge where we give the data away to the community and say, this is the regression, this is the classification result, can you do better? These data enable progress on the multifuel learning, and it enables search for features across languages because we will also put the German and the Czech data. And it also enables study from different channels. Some were in soundproof booth and some not. And of course, we plan to collect more multimodal data. When I was at Johns Hopkins, a guy from Madrid, a neurologist, was there, and we agreed to collect more data. And again, the app that can be used for data collection, we'll put that as an open source on the web. We did not look at early dementia, at early Alzheimer, as much as we could, but you don't have the data. We did not differentiate between the different kinds of Alzheimer. We did not distinguish between healthy control and people with mild cognitive impairment, which is a pre-state to Alzheimer. And we did not distinguish between Parkinson caused by dysarthria and other forms of dysarthria, like stroke. Those are challenges for the future. And what we need to do is we need to integrate a system like our phone app that can do explicit testing. Please say Padaka. It can be used for explicit computer-aided therapy. It can be used for unobtrusive implicit monitoring, and it can be used for interaction with a clinician. And that on one platform, and I think that's the way to go. That's our vision. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention and open the floor for questions.
Interesting talk. We are slightly out of time. I didn't dare, to stop keynote speaker. So please, just few quick questions. Okay.
I think that deep learning techniques are a perfect match for such a task. Do you know if such techniques are being applied in this area?
The what?
Deep learning.
Yes, deep learning is the way to go, but you have very few data. And currently, I mean, we did use some deep learning, for instance, for the speech recognizer we trained. And it was good. It was good because we had enough abundant data out there in the world to train a speech recognizer on. If you have 50 people, I don't think deep learning will give you much. 50 healthy controls, For certain things, absolutely, you're totally right. Like if you want to build a speech recognition engine and then measure the a posteriori probability, you can take any human voice, quote unquote, from that language, and deep learning will give you a better recognizer. If you want to look at a certain specific feature where you compare healthy controls in a dedicated test, you don't have that dedicated test for so many healthy controls. That's a problem. So I'm aware of deep learning. For some of the cases where I can use it, I do. And for others, I would say support vector machines are probably better because you have a high-dimensional feature vector and you try to classify, and support vector machines do that very good. So, yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
When you were monitoring this sequential data for patients who are taking the medicine on a regular basis, did you notice that? I do not know what the time period was. So over the time period, did their condition anyways get worse, or did the medicine always?
I think that's the predicted UPDRS. The 0 was what they had been classified like 2 weeks before. And then you see is the speech signal, is the gait signal higher or lower than the 0, the predicted one. And we did see a tendency. It's too early to say that this is a result. We had 7 patients. But I think this exponential decay model is a way to predict it and then compare. And I think if we have enough data, that's one of the next projects I would like to do. And of course, as I said, for ethical reasons, you cannot tell the people don't take it. And I would say, especially when they knew they were being recorded, they were very precise about taking the medicine. And on a regular day, they probably don't. And I'm very sure that if you can predict the intake or forgotten intake based on, especially gait, it just shows up much more better in the gait.
Okay, so some other questions? Yes?
Are you able to monitor hand tremor with your application as well, or does it, do you use it only for recording?
Well, the handwriting is not bad. It still requires a tablet, but I would say wait 2 years. Then you get these intelligent pens.
I mean, just by monitoring the accelerometer data from.
Good question. I would probably try to do that in a smartwatch. Put the accelerator in a smartwatch. The smart shoe is no problem. And you know, in 5 years, these people will wear shoes, or the first models will come out where you take your shoe, and in the bottom of the shoe there is this accelerator, and at the end of the day you put them on a place and the battery is charged, and at the same time the data are downloaded, and then you have them in your local computer, and then you know how much did they walk and how did they behave with the accelerator and that kind of stuff. And probably the same thing with your smartwatch.
So you want to use the gait data as the primary indicator to the progression of the diseases.
I think the arms are the same thing, you know. So it's just a question. Everybody wears shoes, and I can put a sensor in the shoe. If somebody wears a smartwatch, I have a place to put at least for one arm I can get. If I don't have any sensor on my arm, then you know I can't get the data. So I think anything you can get it. And you know, ensuring privacy is one of the most important questions. But once you make sure that this is done, and if you have the consent agreement of the person, of course, you know, he would like to know, am I getting worse or better? One of the interesting patients data set is people who have a rare form of sleep deprivation. That they talk and move very strong, and 80% of those will develop Parkinson within like 3 or 5 years. So they know it's coming. And I was at a convention with these kind of people, and they're eager. They're eager to know what's going to happen with me, and they know it's fatal. And you know, they would use any sensor they could get. Currently, we have no cure for it. Okay, so I think, you know, if you have a person like a Parkinson person who sees the doctor in a 6-month period, wouldn't you want to know after 2 months, oops, I better change the medication rate? So that's, and you know, if the person is living alone, doesn't have a spouse anymore, and the rate of these people who live alone is increasing exponentially. A spouse notices and then calls the doctor and says, hey, I think my husband or my wife is doing this and that. If you don't have that, then we need these automatic systems that give an alert and say, And then, you know, you can have the doctor call up and say, hey, how are you doing? And he doesn't even notice he's being tested, but the doctor does a couple tests by just listening. 80% of his evaluation comes from the informal tests. So I think that's the way to go.
Okay, so sorry, I must stop this discussion now because we are out of time. I think everyone can come to you and ask you
Sure,
questions
absolutely.
lately. So thank you very much once
Yeah.
again.